Okay, I want to begin this recording of the Holy Qur'an as an offering to friends and students. I've been a religious studies teacher for many years and a philosopher, an expert in comparative religion and mysticism, particularly esotericism and the transpersonal history of mankind. The Qur'an is obviously one of the absolute core texts of human history. It influences the second greatest religion on the planet. And I would argue that given that it's so peppered with references to Christ and to Jesus, it has immense importance also for Christianity. So, and obviously if Muslims and Christians could make peace with each other, a large part of the world would have been reconciled. So this recording of the Qur'an is for everybody's benefit, really, for Muslims themselves, for Christians, for the Jewish peoples of the planet. Again, what I'll have to say, hopefully, from a transpersonal explanation perspective, I will be trying to explain the Qur'an in my own understanding within a transpersonal historical framework. I mean, it's a historical document. It was transmitted by Muhammad over a period of years. Then it was remembered and recorded by his friends and companions, and eventually written down, but not till Uthman's time as the third caliph, and in rather political circumstances. So the text is not as Muhammad. It's not in the order that it came in. There's still debate in scholarly circles the exact chronological order. There have been enormous attempts to interpret the Qur'an on many, many levels, particularly by Sufis who've stressed the mystical interpretation. And this is the lineage and tradition that I myself come from. And later on I may share some of the details of that. But it is a universal document. It belongs to all mankind. It's part of the humanistic heritage of mankind's spiritual searchings, and it has many wonderful points and other points which I hope to explain historically. So my intention in making this recording is to provide an English recording for English speakers of the Quranic text, firstly, but secondly a running commentary, so to say, on my understanding. And it's obviously all human understanding is limited. This is circumscribed by my own background, my own historical education and formation and so on. I suppose I ought to say a little bit about my own interest in Islam. Where to begin? In my own intellectual journey and searching after truth, I came to the belief fairly early on that there's more to life than meets the eye. I was a great lover of poetry as a young teenager. I found in the great poets of the world, whom I read and devoured. I read Chinese poetry in Arthur Waley's translations. I read Rilke, the great German poet, and I read T.S. Eliot, the great British poet, Wallace Stevens, a great American poet, and encouraged by my English teacher, a great teacher in Brighton Grammar School, where I was studying in the 60s at this time, from about the age of 12 to 14, I decided I wanted to become a poet. It seemed to me that only poets were speaking truth on the planet. The science teachers I had couldn't explain life's hidden, deeper mysteries, and in fact they ruled out any questions I asked about, what is gravity or whatever. They said, no, we don't know, just learn the formulae. So I rebelled against the arrogance of natural science and decided that nobody was speaking truth on the planet apart from the poets. And so I began my own journey as a poet, in which I would express and did express and do express my own metaphysical understandings of illumination and so on. I discovered also music in the poetry of people like Bob Dylan. They were also speaking these these truths, and I admired them, and in my own way I'm a bit of a bard. Later I discovered, through my study of classical literature and history for an A-level in ancient history, I discovered the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, and I learned about Epicurus and Plato. I studied with the classics master of Brighton College, which was one of the best public schools in Britain, who was my private tutor in classics, and I absolutely felt I'd come home when I discovered the ancient Greek wisdom tradition, and nobody at school had told me about philosophy before. I didn't know there was such a thing, really, as a systematic body of the intellectual study of the inspiration and insight that poetry can transport you to. Poetry is the stealing of the coals of wisdom, if you want, from heaven. Philosophy is the rational description of what it feels like to see those burning coals. And ever since, I've been in love with both, and I still am a practicing poet. I've met many poets around the planet from all religions. I've been to various international poetry festivals, particularly in Macedonia, at Lake Ohrid, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and read my poetry to audiences there. I've recorded poems. I'm in the middle of recording my complete poetic works, and I have great honour for all the poets of the world. I run an order of Poets for Peace, which is a network of interconnected poets, but it was philosophy that then called me. Having discovered philosophy and reading philosophy, I then discovered that ancient Greek heritage of philosophy is continuing to this day. I discovered with just joy, actually, that although the ancient Greeks are long past, that the torch was passed to Roman civilization. I read Cicero and discovered the delights of Latin philosophy and literature, and then transmitted on through Christianity and the classical heritage of European civilization in its Christian mode. And I read Augustine and other Christian philosophers, discovered the heroes of those traditions, Abelard and Duns Scotus and so on, and the Celtic Christians, St. Columba, and then of course the more modern philosophers, Bacon and Descartes and John Locke and Hume and all the rest of them, and plunged myself into a very detailed study of the history of philosophy. And this took me on a period of 4 years intensive study. Now, I'd also explored Islamic teachings in the Qur'an, and by this time, when I was 19 approximately, I came into contact with a Sufi teaching in Brighton called Rashid, who'd been initiated. He was British, but he'd been initiated into an Egyptian order of Sufis in Egypt. And I was very impressed by the depth and the resonance, the taste, if you want, of his disciples in Brighton, and their integrity. There was an amazing group of people. This was in 1974, 5, 6. And I lived for 6 months in a commune among some of these disciples, and it was my first, well, not my completely first, but one of my earliest tastes of spiritual mysticism in practice, in long late night discussions with some of these Sufis about the nature of the beloved. And I fell in love with one of his disciples, who was a beautiful woman who I felt was speaking from her heart when she discoursed about God and the beloved. And they used to go to zikr on a Friday night, and I had a strong sense that these people knew what God was, had a taste and a love for God that was beyond books, beyond words. There was something deeper here than mere study in the intellectual sense, much as I love philosophy and was deeply committed to it. And by now I was doing a degree in philosophy at the University of Bristol. I sensed that here was something much deeper. There was an actual experience of God. And so this made me think about Sufism particularly, and I read Idris Shah's book on the Sufis, and I met people who were from the Sufi tradition, either connected with that particular circle or others, and I had a series of profound experiences at this time, divine openings, illuminations, call them what you want, and I sensed there was a path, there was a tariqah, there was a definite opening up, and however, my intellectual heritage, my commitment to philosophy and to science, my parents had been, or my mother particularly, had been influenced by Marxism and the idea of social science, and that the important thing was to get social justice on the planet and liberation from suffering and poverty, and that mysticism, in their eyes, was a kind of luxury that was a kind of form of escapism, that the real struggle was political and economic, and that to indulge in mysticism and meditation was a kind of corruption, if you want, of what we should really be doing. And that also inspired me. I read some of the socialist literature, Marxist literature, and agreed with its interest and commitment to justice, social justice. But I disagreed with its complete negation of spirituality. I'd had enough experiences by then to know that that was a false teaching. But I knew it was very influential, and this was the time of the late 70s. People were on the left or not, and I was trying to find my way, where to sit in relation to that. Now, to cut a long story short, I decided I was supposed to be studying philosophy, but it was a very narrow course I was being taught at Bristol University with Stephen Corner. It was Kantian deconstruction of all metaphysics. It was Wittgenstein, and it was logical positivism. It was Ayer. And it was people who were telling me that metaphysics was meaningless and insignificant, and in fact erroneous, and that all that philosophy can do is point out that religion is wrong, basically, and that all metaphysical speculation is wrong. Now, I was very disappointed by this. I'd gone to university to study philosophy because I was in love with metaphysics, because I'd read Plato, because I'd read Spinoza. I'd been deeply in love with Spinoza's idea that you could understand the nature of God and the inner workings of God, and that's what I'd gone to philosophy to study. I'd not read, but I'd heard of Hegel. I'd read Bradley. I knew there was this idealist tradition, and that's what I wanted to find out about. But I was being told by my lecturers and fellow students that I was mad, that all philosophy was about the ending of mysticism, and I was surrounded by clever people telling me I was wrong. And eventually I rebelled, I'm afraid. I thought it wasn't worth, I refused to join that club of the logical positivist Wittgensteinian, destroyer of metaphysics. And I had already by then discovered the ancient Celtic path, the pagan Celtic Druid path. And I had been studying Hinduism and yoga and Buddhism, and got very interested in Tantric Buddhism, and I realised that Druidry was the British and Irish equivalent to all these ancient wisdom traditions. I'd realised by then a kind of universal experience, an enlightenment experience, when I was 20, that it doesn't matter what name you use. I mean, I'd met Wiccans as well, and so on. That the thing is the enlightenment experience, the access to the divinity, or the transpersonal divinity. I'd studied Jung by then as well, and read Memories, Dreams and Reflections, and felt that Jung's path was a superb navigation of these worlds, connecting the mundane and the supernatural worlds. And so how they all hang together, what's the map? That was the question. What's the bigger picture we need here? I didn't feel it could be any one tradition. There had to be a bigger narrative. And we needed, the job of philosophy was to do what it should be doing, which is to provide the meta-narrative, to explain the whole thing. As Maimonides wrote, A Guide for the Perplexed. I decided we needed one now. It couldn't be the same as his, because that was then, and there was less information that Maimonides had to process. So what I decided to do because the University of Bristol wasn't providing me with the kind of philosophical education I wanted or needed, I decided to study alone. This was from a career perspective, a stupid decision, in that I would not get my degree. I would not graduate with a degree. This would mean I couldn't have certain professional doors opened. But from an intellectual and a moral and spiritual perspective, I think it was the right thing to have done. And I decided, in order to study, I would move to Canada, my birth country. And I spent 3 years, nearly 4 years, in intensive private research and study, in which I read through, in a detailed program. Whilst working, I worked in bookshop managing in Calgary Airport, and then in a hospital for veteran soldiers who'd been in the Canadian Army, and those professional experiences were very important to me. I was deeply moved by talking to these old soldiers in Canada, and about life and death and war, and also their own spirituality. Many of them were Christian, some were Freemasons. I got to know them extremely well. They bequeathed to me many secrets of life and death, and then my job when they died was to wash the corpse and put it in a body bag and take it to the morgue. And I'd never seen death before, and here I was dealing with death. Now this made me deeply humble, actually, and determined to continue and deepen and sharpen my philosophical studies. To me, philosophy is a matter of life and death. What happens to the soul after death is the fundamental question of human existence. Why are we here? Why are we in these bodies? What are we for? During this time, I also decided to remain celibate. I didn't want to let relationships complicate my quest for spirituality, and that meant I had free time to study, and I was also practicing my own prayer life during those 4 years in intensive daily meditation and prayer, as I have ever since. And it was during that time then in Canada when I set out on this universal quest of wisdom. I used the resources of the University of Calgary Library, where I lived for 3 years, 3.5 years, and of course they had all the great classics of world philosophy and religion, so I was able to study using those sources. I did some courses in anthropology at the university to access the library. I'm deeply grateful to the University of Calgary. It's one of the great paradises on this planet, and I spent many, many happy hours there studying away. And it was during that time that I read pretty much the entire corpus of global philosophy. It's when I read the complete works of Plato right through for the first time. It's when I read Aristotle for the first time, right through. And the Bible. I'd never read fully the Bible. I read it completely. Now each time I read one of these great classics, I would have with me dictionaries, scholarly apparatus, maps, reference books, and so on. I read it as a scholar, not just, as a kind of idle thing. Obviously I'd been trained in philosophy by then, and I used all my philosophical skills to analyse and research the text in front of me. I'd also been trained as a historian, and obviously had an A-level in ancient history, and history had been my favourite subject, I think, apart from English, but history at school. And I thought as a historian, so I wanted to know the history of these texts, and I would read with dictionaries, with reference books, and so on. And the more I read, the more astounded I became, the more my sense of wonder grew, and my sense of love for mankind, for the planet. Here all these great texts were saying the same thing, ultimately. They were pointing towards a higher order of reality, which I'd tasted without really knowing what it was. In that experience with the Sufi circles, with some of the yoga groups I'd meditated with, some of the Buddhist groups, I tasted that divine essence, yet nobody could really explain it. Nobody knew what it was. And so now I was seeing that the great minds of history had actually described it, and that's where these sacred scriptures are all coming from. I read the Buddhist scriptures, the Lotus Sutra, the Dhammapada completely. I read the Tibetan scriptures, I read Milarepa, I read the great Hindu scriptures, the Upanishads, which I'd already read, but I reread. And then I came to the Qur'an. And when I read the Qur'an, again, I was entranced, I was in wonder, because the Qur'an struck me as coming from that same place. It was a superb channeling or transmission through Muhammad of divine truths. And I knew without a shadow of doubt that he had touched those same places that all the great saints, the true saints and mystics of the planet, have touched, from whatever tradition. And there was nothing in the Qur'an that couldn't be an object of beauty and justice and truth for mankind. I also read commentaries on the Qur'an. I read the hadiths, and not in completeness, obviously, it's a vast text, but these are the sayings of Muhammad. I read many of them, and I went on to read many or most of the great Islamic philosophers, again, not in complete text, but I read Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and Ibn Arabi, and I spent months reading the great jewels of Sufism and Islamic philosophy and mysticism, and my sense of love and awe and wonder was deeply moved to the very foundation. I felt I'd come home, and these were my brothers and sisters, because there were female Sufis and mystics as well. And I obviously read historical texts about the history of Islamic philosophy at the same time, and I read the great classics of that. I used the Encyclopedia of Islam. So at the same time then, I was also studying, or later, because I planned this 4 years of study in a very detailed way. It was the kind of course I wanted to have had at university but hadn't been offered. So I planned it myself. So I spent 6 months studying Islam in depth. Then I moved to Christianity and studied the history of Christian teachings, and I think actually it was the other way around. I did the Christian first. So I read the Church Fathers, the Gospels, Acts, the whole New Testament, and then the Gnostic scriptures, and the history of the Church, and the history of theology, the Church Fathers, up to the Middle Ages, and so on. And I kind of, then I would move to look at Eastern thought and Buddhist thought, the evolution. I tended to work in 500-year chunks, so I'd spend 3 or 4 months working on 500 years in the Middle East, then shift to 500 years in Europe, and so on. I made a methodical grid to cover the entire history of the world's intellectual heritage. This is quite ambitious for a 22-year-old young man, but I wanted to find ultimate truth, and I took philosophy seriously, and that's, when one is young, one has the energy, you feel you have the whole of life ahead of you. I knew it would take me 4 years, and it did, but I succeeded. And what I was very saddened by, really, was by the time it got to 1981, I'd got up to 1900, and I'd covered the entire base of human spiritual history up to then. I'd read the great American philosophers, I'd read Emerson and Thoreau, the history of New Thought. I'd been reading the history of American transcendentalism and pragmatism, and William James and so on. In Europe, I read obviously the great European traditions. I read Descartes and Bacon, and up through Hegel. I read Marx and Engels, and I felt there was a common platform here, that all the great traditions of mankind's intellectual history were in common. There was a commonality, and if only we could all talk to each other across the barricades, there could be peace. I was nursing soldiers who were telling me that war was the most horrible thing on the planet, and that we should strive our utmost to prevent it, which I agreed with. And then the Iranian Revolution broke out, and before long the American hostage crisis blew up. I didn't have a television, but I had access to radio, which I listened to in my beautiful cabin in the mountains outside Calgary in the long winter snows, and with incredible scenic, beautiful snowscapes. And I was deeply moved and worried, because I'd read Shi'ism, I'd read Ali, I'd read the Imam stories, and I knew that Shi'ism was another extraordinary mystical path. I'd come across Mullah Sadra and the Illuminationist school of Shi'ism. I knew that there was a quality and depth of thinking there that was as profound as anything else in the history of global philosophy. And I was moved when the Iranian Revolution happened, but I was upset when it began to appear that there was going to be, that the politicians of the world, the leaders, the presidents, the rulers, somehow were not able to deal with this spiritual energy that had come. And I was nursing patients especially when the hostage crisis broke out, which was an illegitimate usurpation and in my opinion, antithetical to international law and obviously immoral. Carter was faced with a huge dilemma ethically, and so was the world. And I felt my voice needed to be heard. I wanted to stand up and say, "Make peace, brothers." You all come from the divine source. There's no need for this fighting. Carter himself was a Christian and a deep man, and I knew he was a good man at heart. But of course, political events moved, and there seemed to be no kind of peace going on here. Then Reagan was elected and the hostages were released, but it was a frightening and dangerous world. I felt there wasn't peace now, and Reagan particularly was beginning to ratchet up the war on the Russians particularly, and all the rhetoric of a hard line against the Soviet Union. Now, I'd read Russian philosophy and Marxist thought. I knew that deep down there was a justice urge there, but I also knew it had been betrayed and led astray, although I didn't know all the details because my studies had only taken me up to 1900. So anyway, to cut a very long story short, I wondered where to go. I had all this accumulated knowledge of philosophy and mysticism. I wanted to say to the world, make peace. But I needed to be in the right place. Being stuck in a cabin in the mountains of Alberta, I felt, wasn't the right sounding board. And to cut a long story short, I then moved to... I travelled throughout Canada, and I wondered about going to somewhere symbolic, somewhere esoteric, like the Himalayas. I thought of setting up an ashram in the Himalayas. I thought of going to another spiritual centre, namely Jerusalem. Maybe I could go there and teach about divine unity and healing and so on. But in the end, I decided that I needed to be in a place of access to books, to further studies. I knew I hadn't completed. I'd only got up to 1900. And I now wanted to study the 20th century and understand where this Cold War had come from. Why was this hatred between East and West, in absolute detail? And between Islam and the West. What was going on in the Iranian thing? And Israel and Palestine. How could that be solved? So, to cut a long story short, I moved to London and founded, with a friend, John Francis Phipps, a body called Philosophers and Historians for Peace, which was the kind of institutionalization of my wish to do something to help heal the planet. And I felt London was a good base to do this from.